there's an increase in demand for innovative solutions. So there's no surprise here. Changes to working practices throughout COVID have increased demand for RegTech solutions that can, enhance oversight, improve collaboration, and boost overall efficiency. And this is reflected in the sales trends across the industry. So for example, from our study, we saw that 42% said they experienced a high uptick in sales over the last 6 months. Meanwhile, 50% of firms said that they saw a moderate increase in sales over the last 6 months. What's also interesting to note is that 50% of survey respondents said the sales cycle has somewhat shortened recently, while 8% reported that the sales cycle has significantly shortened over the last year. And lastly, when it comes to where is this new business coming from, the majority, 50% of new business is reportedly coming from banks, followed by financial institutions. So with that, panelists, I'd love to hear your thoughts on these key findings. For the first one, I'm going to direct this question at you, Robert. So when it comes to the pandemic, how has the ongoing crisis influenced RegTech?
For sure. Thank you very much. So I think your survey is excellent. I do. Thank you very much for making that public, and that report is a fantastic milestone. I mean, the FCA said originally RegTech was new technologies developed to help overcome regulatory challenges in financial services. So obviously things like KYC, AML are things that people go to straight off. But as we discussed before going on to make the live session, regulatory challenges encompass everything from GDPR as well through to everything else, which is the area that we're in. And as Vasile said, almost every business is going to be affected by various different regulatory challenges, and indeed GDPR affects every business. So I think what happened with the pandemic was to overcome those regulatory challenges, suddenly people were, well, how do we work from home? So you could almost in that point put Zoom into a RegTech at that point, because it was helping banks overcome regulatory challenges of trading. So I think it's broadened the definition of RegTech and the awareness of RegTech. It's also led to a massive increase, as we'll talk about later, in online cloud adoption. And it's made people just look for ways to achieve what they had when they had 100 people in a room to having 100 people online instead and working from home. So in my mind, that's really the major impact has been that ability for to bring banks to the table, to bring the rest of financial services to the table. And we're seeing other businesses as well. And I echo the sales cycle shortening point as well.
Yeah, makes sense. And then when it comes to, we said before that most of this RegTech business is coming from banks. Nirvana, I want to ask you this. Why do you think this is the case?
Well, with the onset of the pandemic, what we saw was, businesses shutting down, people getting laid off, and, almost the whole economy coming to a grinding halt. And what happened was that businesses like banks suddenly discovered that, well, we can't go into our offices or the brick and mortar buildings. So their operations had to be extended outside of their brick and mortar offices into people's home environments. So from then, it was necessary to have some RegTech solutions or look to RegTech to start putting parameters in place so that they can conduct their business and continue as normally as possible. So that's kind of what we saw happening. And, prior to the pandemic, there was a lot of areas of research and investment going into R&D and RegTech type solutions. But when we hit the pandemic and the devastation of that, it was an absolute necessity for firms to start ramping up. And really, within a period of a couple of months, we did about 10 years worth of digital transformation, I think, during the pandemic. So it was pretty hard going. And, for someone like me who's been flying the flag for RegTech for such a long time, it was actually as negative as the pandemic and devastating the outcome has been, it was a positive thing for the RegTech industry, because now people are no longer asking, what's the market opportunity in RegTech? They're actually saying, well, where can we get our hands on the relevant RegTech solutions so that we can continue our operations? So that's the answer in terms of the banks. And that's affected actually all sectors and businesses, not just banks. Any industry that's hit with any type of regulation requires some kind of RegTech solution to keep abreast and keep automation going and help them through this crisis.
Yeah, and this kind of leads into our next question just around the sales cycle. So Jay, I want to ask you, why do you think the sales cycle has shortened for RegTech solutions?
Well, I think the sales cycle shortened because suddenly projects which were on the back burner became very important in institutions. Purely the adoption of Zoom and Microsoft Teams and other collaboration tools suddenly went from project number 100 to project number 1. And we've heard that from many banks. We've been speaking to even Zoom guys, and they were like, we're having so much business just coming through. We need to implement next week. And that was, the first 2 months of the pandemic. But the sales cycle really shortened because I believe there was a change in how regulators were doing supervision, because previously they were able to be in the building in those large banks, and they were able to audit them, in the building, on place, sitting next to a person and understanding what the person does. Suddenly they're asking these questions remotely, and then the management is trying to come up with the answers, and they don't have the answers. So they had to email to everyone within their teams asking, well, can you send me this document? Can you send me that document? How do you do this? Have you done that? Suddenly they realized we need more transparency into how we work. And I think that put a lot more pressure on implementing some solutions, which just brings transparency into what people do, how they do it, and some reporting, some understanding of what are we actually doing around certain compliance. And I think regulators also started realizing that, we actually need banks to use systems to provide that type of data. And it's not just transaction reporting, it's not just AML KYC, but actually, actual conduct. We need to look into conduct and how is conduct communicated, how is conduct not enforced, but followed within those organizations.
Yeah, exactly. And lastly, I want to address this question. So probably either you, Sarah, or you, Robert, in terms of your perspective, have you seen your organization's sales cycle shortened? If so, what have those changes been?
Yeah, so I mean, we're a new business, so in a way, I don't have that history, but I think there's a number of factors at play, and it's actually interesting. A lot of your questions you could equally answer from a more general perspective, and rather than how has a pandemic helped. I think there's a general increased acknowledgement that RegTech is necessary, and regulation itself is. It's not going away. There's more and more of it, and firms are really struggling under the weight of that. So, it feels like a move towards closing that gap. So I think to go with that, from a RegTech perspective, we need to play our part. Obviously, we want to be commercially viable and successful. So the question, is how can we have a really efficient sales process? So I think it works, for our good, but also for the good of the firms that will benefit from our solutions.
Yeah, I'd agree on that. And in terms of the changes, I agree about all the answers before as well. In terms of the changes we've made, funnily enough, the big change we've made is to make the next steps in the process clearer in the purchasing, because it's been shortened. Beforehand, you had more chance to well, not more chance, but you had to go a bit slower. Now everything's going a bit faster. We've made that more efficient in saying visibility over that process. And one little bit I might throw in on why is it coming from banks is maybe because they were behind the curve. I think large banks tend to be large. And my view on RegTech adoption has been that smaller companies have been faster to adopt before, and maybe that banks have been slower to the table. And what's happened, because they've had to come to the table really quickly, they formed that big chunk in that slide you've got there with the stats. But also the second big chunk there was other businesses, non-financial. So as going back to Jay's point, I think it was both Jay and Vasile, it's really affected everybody. But I think that's where everyone's just been trying to get up to speed super quick.
And just on that, I'd like to add to Robert's point that, you're also seeing the other entrants that have been coming in from the fintechs and the fintech banks. So as he rightly said, the traditional brick and mortar banks were pretty much behind the curve, with the new fintechs having cutting edge technology and what have you. So absolutely agree with that.
Actually, to add to what have you done to speed up the sales process? What we really found in the last 18 months is we've had so much demand coming from compliance, even from small organizations, not just in financial services. But what's been interesting is that a lot of compliance officers, heads of compliance, came to us saying, I need to buy a solution, but I have never bought a solution before. So can you help me to actually sell it internally? So we've done a lot of work on implementing business cases that compliance officers can actually present internally to buy solutions, to buy technology, and to help them sell that internally. Because what we found is that, compliance has been generally behind the curve, but now every compliance department is looking for a solution.